Hey guys, so last week we made a list of different organisms that can be found when you guys went outside, and then we also listed some abiotic factors as well. And then I had you guys make a food chain for me, and we do have some here. And this is kind of an example that someone gave to me, and I'm going to go through a few of them, not too many, because that took up too much of my last recording. But in this case, we have the sun, and the sun should probably be on everybody's beginning part of the food chain. The sun is a abiotic factor. It's a non-living thing, guys, but it does provide a ton of energy to all of our animals and plants and producers in our food chains. And you know that because we talked about a little bit about energy pyramids last week. The sun is giving all this giant amount of energy, and it goes to these producers, this area here in green. These things, because they have so much energy available to them, there's so many of them. And what that means is if you go outside, you're going to see mostly producers as a living thing, because they have so much energy available to them. The other word here for producers is called an autotroph, a self-feeder. And every level that you see on this pyramid is known as a trophic level, a feeding level. So autotrophs are self-feeders. They have a ton of energy available to them. They get the bottom or the first level of the pyramid. They also occupy the biggest area of the pyramid too, because there are so many of them. They have so much biomass. So biomass means living mass. And if you were to go outside and chop down everything that was green and then put it on a scale, it would be a huge amount of mass. I mean, just think of how much mass is in a tree, for instance, okay? Now, all that energy is then used. It's used for growth, and some of it is lost as heat and molecular processes. So not all of it's available to our consumers. And the first consumers are generally herbivores. Sometimes they could be an omnivore, but whatever is first in line, whatever's eating the plant, is known as a primary consumer, the first consumer. And because the plants are never fully all the way eaten, there is less energy available to primary consumers than there were to autotrophs. Because there's less energy, there's less of them. You will always see less bunnies than you will grass, if that makes sense. You will always find less deer than there are trees, okay? Now, the deer and the bunnies, they use up energy. They use it to heat their body. They use it to grow fur and shed it every year. And because of that, they have lost energy to our system, and it's not available to whoever eats the primary consumer. And whoever eats that primary consumer is known as a secondary consumer. So in this food chain, we'll have, let's say, a plant, or a flower. It's eaten by a bee. That bee may be eaten by a spider. If that's the case, the spider is the second consumer in the line, so it's known as the secondary consumer, okay? Let's say that spider then is eaten by a third individual. That would be the tertiary consumer. If that one's eaten by a fourth individual, that'd be the quaternary consumer, the pentenary, the hexanary, the septenary, the octenary. It just keeps going, depending on how many things are in a food chain line, okay? So let's look at a few that you guys did last week. Sun gives energy to a tomato plant. I would say that's not really a Minnesota plant. Tomatoes came from South America. They will not exist here in Minnesota. They die. We propagate them in greenhouses and grow them from seeds every year. If you were to leave them out, they would die. So I would like to see that replaced by an apple tree. Apple trees are found in Minnesota. So the sun gives us energy to an apple tree. Could that be eaten by aphids? Yeah, aphids are a tiny little arthropod. They eat the sap from plants. They're a really, really small bug. I doubt a frog would eat aphids. You could do, if it's a small frog, yes, for sure. Let's leave it in there. Let's say the frog eats the aphid. The frog then jumps in the water. It's eaten by a large fish called a bass. That large fish is then eaten by a bald eagle, and bald eagles are kind of fishermen. So that's where they get most of their food. And boom, you have a food chain. If all those things die, they're eaten by fungi. Sure. So this is a pretty good one. If I was to label this, this would be the autotroph. This would be the primary consumer of that autotroph. This would be the secondary consumer. This would be the tertiary consumer. And this would be the quaternary consumer and the top carnivore, or the keystone predator. So let's do a couple more here. This one we have sun giving its energy to grass, an autotroph, yes. Giving its energy to bees, not so much. So bees like flowers and grass does flower, but grass is pollinated by the wind. Bees don't really land on grass to pollinate grass. They don't get their energy from there. So I would like to see this replaced by some sort of big flower. The apple tree would work fine, for instance, where a bee could get its energy from the nectar. Bees are eaten by spiders. Spiders could be eaten by a toad. You got a food chain going on here. It's really good. Okay. So let's do a big long one here. I labeled this one already, modified it a little bit, and we'll zoom in so we can see it maybe a little bit better. Boom, here we go. Sun gives its energy to grass. It's known as a producer. The other word for that is an autotroph, right? Okay. And then that energy is given to a grasshopper because a grasshopper eats it. So you should probably draw an arrow. I'm not going to do that with every one of these, but the arrow goes from the grass to the grasshopper because that's the way the energy goes. Okay. The grasshopper is the first consumer, so it's known as the primary consumer. It also is an herbivore. Okay. It could be a omnivore, for instance. That would be fine too, but whatever is the first consumer in your food chain is known as a primary consumer. If that grasshopper is eaten by a spider, the spider is the secondary consumer. If that spider is eaten by a leopard frog, that's the third consumer in the line, so that's the tertiary consumer. If that leopard frog gets eaten by a garter snake, that's the fourth one, so that's the quaternary consumer. Notice that these are all carnivores. Spider is a carnivore. It only eats animals. A leopard frog is a carnivore. It only eats animals as an adult. A garter snake is also a carnivore. This thing is not eating plants. Okay. A garter snake can be eaten by a raccoon. In fact, they commonly are. If a raccoon finds it, they're definitely going to take advantage of that. The raccoon is the fifth consumer in the line, so that means it's pentanary, like the pentagon's five-sided. Notice that the raccoon is an omnivore. So it's omnivore eating a carnivore, and that's totally fine. Let's say the raccoon is then hunted and eaten by a coyote, which could definitely happen. The coyote is the sixth predator in line, or the sixth consumer in line, so it's hexanary. It's also, in this case, a carnivore, and it's also the top carnivore, and it's also known as a keystone predator. So why is it known as a keystone predator? Well, let's touch base on that real quick. Stones were found in things like archways way back in the day. They are this top stone here, and they hold the archway together. Without that keystone, the arch falls, or the dome would fall, and it collapses. So it's a very, very important stone, probably the most important stone in the archway, hence it's the key stone to have in there. That is usually the top predator in ecology. So if we go here, the coyote has a effect all the way down the food chain. If you remove coyotes, there's a lot of raccoons, let's say. If there's a lot of raccoons, there's going to be less garter snakes. If there's less garter snakes, there's going to be a balloon of leopard frogs. It has resounding effects all the way down the food chain if you remove this keystone. So it's very important to have top predators in your environment. They keep all the other populations in balance and in check. That's why they're known as a keystone organism or keystone species. So that is a food chain. What I would like you to do for the rest of the week is in another video, but we are going to do a food web. And so going back to our notes, if we look at slide 22, here's slide 21 deals with all those names if you want, but slide 22 is this food web where you have multiple food chains linked together to make a food web. So as soon as we have a whole bunch of organisms on there, there's going to be multiple chains branching off, and it gets pretty messy, and that's okay. It's not the end of the world if it's really messy. All right. But you're going to link multiple chains up together to make a food web. On your food web, please make sure that you're labeling, like I do here, if it's a herbivore, a carnivore, or an omnivore. Okay. You can do that with a sticky or a text box or whatever. You'll get more information on what it is that you need to label in the second video, which is you can look at now, okay, on your assignment. And I'll also have an example for you too on Classroom as well. Hopefully that helps, and hopefully we can do a great job on the assignment.